Chapter 6. Information from an Old Friend. I woke later that day from a deep nodding state with a restless spirit. Opening my books, I was quickly distracted by the odd sex laws followed by the early Jewish tribes. It was wrong for a man to lie with another man, but not for a woman to lie with a woman. I thought about being a man back then, about how great it would be to have 3 wives, and go at it with all 3 at the same time. Yeah, I wouldn't want to stop them from doing what came naturally in the heat of passion, either. As I browsed through one picture book on Hebrew history, my eyes were drawn to one particular image, a picture of a judgment seat excavated in Chorazin, outside of Jerusalem. My mind went back to one of Pastor Smythe's sermons. "Woe unto you, Chorazin!" Jesus had said these words in Matthew 11:21. I remembered, but barely, hearing this passage in one of Pastor Smythe's sermons. This particular seat had a familiar image carved into the back. It was a carving that resembled our pentacle, or at least I thought it did. I read the caption. Excavated in Chorazin, this basalt seat of Moses was discovered in the 1920s, and it has an Aramaic inscription remembering Yudin. Jesus references this position of authority. The teachers of the law and the Pharisees sit in Moses' seat, so you must obey them and do everything they tell you, but do not do what they do, for they do not practice what they preach. Matthew 23:2-3. Another has been found in Hamath Tiberias. I wasn't quite sure how this fit in with what we had already discovered, but I ripped the page from the book and put it in my pocket anyway. It was time to meet up with the guys. We would now determine which course of action, if any, to follow. For a moment I considered checking myself into Solomon's mental health hospital and leaving this mystery to solve itself, but I figured it would be best to see things through first. Later on, in the backyard behind Dan's house, I found both Dan and Stephen talking to one another in hushed tones. A fire was burning in the middle of the impressive stone garden. Dan's mother took pride in her garden, cultivating a wide range of flowers, fruits, and herbs. She used to yell at Dan because we would constantly raid her herb garden for some necessary elements for our rituals. Dan would laugh it off and blame it on the large number of chipmunks living in the area. I greeted both of my closest friends and took a seat on the bench by the fire. Judging by the burning of the logs and the formation of the wood pieces, it was clear that Stephen had just started the fire. Stephen and Dan tried to compose their collected thoughts and sputtered back and forth for a moment before Dan said loudly, "We have new information." "We're not sure what it means," Stephen continued, obviously excited to share the new information. "I researched the symbol," he said, pulling out a photocopy of a pentacle. "I saw Dan's art on the wall, and it's the same symbol," he said. "It is the same symbol I spurted onto Melanie." He paused, looking at me to continue. "It's the same symbol Adam drew before he shot himself," I confirmed. "It is the symbol for Shamash, the god of the sun and storm," Dan jumped in. "It's known as the Shamash Standard." Shamash! There was that name again. I thought it over quickly in my head. I noticed that Stephen was reading my face, and he smiled. He had made the same connection. Hebrew and Eblate are similar languages, both originating in an ancient Near East, Stephen said, looking for my reaction. I sort of sat there, mulling it over, not knowing what this all meant, but knowing there must be a connection. "There's more," Stephen continued. "Look at this." He inverted the sign, and it formed an arch cross. "This pentacle has been hidden for generations." I shared my own discoveries, explaining the random picture I had found carved on the back of a seat found in ancient Chorazin. "So you're telling me this symbol was found on a Sumerian temple, on a judgment seat in Chorazin, and it's the same pentacle from my wall, Stephen's sperm, and Adam's grave," Dan said, collecting what we'd learned so far. "Like every other clue," I said. "They could be related, but also could be a coincidence." "I'm fed up with coincidences," Dan said. "Something must be done." His words rang loud and true. We needed to make sense of the new findings, and I knew just who could help us. "Are you guys cool?" I asked. "Yeah, we're cool," Stephen said, pouring some white powder onto his wrist and snorting it deeply. I could see from the size of Dan's pupil that he was all right. "Well, guys, I have to figure this out," I said. "And the only person I know who is familiar with ancient studies is—" I could see Stephen shaking his head. "Yes, Pastor Smythe." "Well, have fun," Stephen said, quickly turning his back and walking off. "It couldn't hurt to ask," Dan said, "but don't let him in too far. I'd go with you, but I forgot how to move my feet. I'll stop by tomorrow after I talk to him." And with that, I left my friend sitting by the fire. All personal feelings aside, Pastor Smythe was an expert. He got his master's degree in ancient Near Eastern studies from Brandeis, so I figured that he might have a clue. I stopped my car in front of the familiar church where I had spent a good portion of my childhood. I'd had so many dreams and aspirations during my time attending this church. That was back before my parents had split up. I knew my parents fought a lot, but I just thought it was normal. I never knew the reason they were getting divorced until one day my dad showed up at the house to grab some stuff with his boyfriend waiting in the car. After the divorce, my mother changed drastically. She started drinking heavily and smoking pot. She quickly and unhealthily lost a lot of weight and began dating different guys with motorcycles. I wasn't mad at my dad for being gay. It was more that I didn't really care. I got madder at the way my mom began to badmouth him to me. Anytime I did something to piss her off, she would say, "You're turning into a queer like your father." Or when I went over my dad's house to visit, she would say, "Oh, you're going over to your faggot's house. Father." Over the past few years, my mom has settled down with a steady boyfriend, and my dad has moved to Florida, but the divorce has fucked me up and ruined my family. When I thought of my parents, I couldn't help but feel bitter. As I look back, I realized that perhaps our entire coven had turned to witchcraft to rebel against the religion of our parents. We rebelled against a religion that preached love for each other, while its adherents treated the people closest to them like shit. I parked near the church and walked up to the parsonage, a large Victorian house across the street. I knocked on the door and heard a young voice yell to come in. Inside, I quickly ran into Kristen, the little girl I used to play with and whisper jokes to in Sunday school. She was Pastor Smythe's oldest daughter. My parents used to think that one day the two of us might get married. She was all grown up now, and she was hot in an innocent sort of way. From what I'd heard, she was the only girl known to ignore Stephen's advances. "Daddy's in the study," she said, pointing down the hall. I walked down the creaking wood floor, feeling as though I were walking to my death. As I neared the end of the hallway, I could see Pastor Smythe through the partially open door. I let myself in. "Pastor Smythe," I said. He looked up from a large, dusty book. He was wearing reading glasses and was dressed in blue jeans and a sweatshirt reading York Beach, Maine. "Jeff, how are you doing?" he asked, sounding sincere. We made small talk for a few minutes and discussed Adam, but I didn't go into much detail. Can't let him in, I thought, recounting some of my feelings towards Adam. After nearly an hour of this, I started toward the door, but casually said, "By the way, Pastor Smythe, have you seen this symbol before?" I pulled out the sketch of the pentacle from the day before. He studied it closely. "Looks familiar," he said. "I thought it may have something to do with Shamash," I offered quietly. His eyes lit up. "Jeff, have you been studying ancient literature?" he teased, before smiling and jumping up from his chair. He grabbed several grimy books off his bookshelf and began leafing through them until he found the same picture that Stephen had shown me earlier. "Here it is," he said. This symbol was the seal of Shamash. It is also a symbol that many in ancient history used to depict the sun, or the god of the sun. What most people don't know, Jeff, is that this old god Shamash is the same as the Egyptian god Osiris. One of my professors would lecture on a little-known theory called the Osirian myth. This myth equated Nimrod the hunter from Genesis with the Sumerian deity Shamash, the Egyptian Osiris, and the Syrian god Tiamat. According to myth, all four of these gods were hacked to pieces and spread throughout the ancient world in some manner. They were then collected and reassembled by their sister/wives. "Sister/wives?" I asked. These women were thought to be powerful goddesses of sex and fertility, Pastor Smythe answered. I immediately thought of Witch Bonnie calling Shamash the Watcher of the World. All of a sudden, what Stephen had said about girls getting pregnant at her grave made more sense. So what you're saying is that these guys married their sisters? Yes, Jeff, Smythe responded, but you're missing the point here. They were cut up and sent to the corners of the world. My professor believed that this original story began with Nimrod and was eventually spread throughout the ancient world, and all of these other stories are interpolations based on the myth of Nimrod. Who killed Nimrod? I asked. Well, it's the followers of light that are charged with this deed. Nimrod is considered the father of polytheism. This legend explains that Shem, the son of Noah, murdered Nimrod and sent his body parts across the ancient world to show the people how much the true God hated polytheism. In Egyptian mythology, the cutter is Seth. Interesting, I said, mulling it all over. Pastor Smythe noted my interest and continued. This same myth is found over and over again in the various early cultures in the Near East. That's where my professor's hypothesis, the Osirian myth, comes in. My mind raced toward Adam's misadventure, the followers of light. Maybe that meant the officers at Adam's house. It certainly couldn't be a coincidence that the officers had acted so suspiciously. Could it? Jeff? Pastor Smythe asked. Jeff, are you all right, son? I have to go, I said, grabbing my drawing from his desk. Is there anything more you want to discuss? Pastor Smythe said with a stern look. No thanks. Hey, I'll tell my mother you said hi, I said, and took off, ignoring his further attempts to get answers. As I was driving home, I remembered what Bonnie had said about Shamash, about how he controls the souls of dead men. I pulled into my driveway, put out my cigarette, and walked up to my front door. I had expected my mother's car to be in the driveway, but it was gone. She must be having a good time, I thought, as I opened the door and promptly crashed on the couch. Half asleep, my mind drifted back to 5th grade at Victory Christian School. Adam had found an adult comic book on the ground outside of his house and had snuck it into school, where we read it secretly during recess. Nick Curry kept trying to see why we were being so secretive, but we managed to get through the day without anyone else knowing about it. I don't remember the exact title, but it was all about the occult and demonology. We didn't understand some of the words, but we both knew that we had stumbled upon something bigger than anything we had known before. One of the characters in the comic book was a man named Inkhead, who tattooed himself and was able to summon the tattoo ink from his body to do his bidding. I remember how strongly that story had influenced Adam. From then on, Adam would draw strange pictures on his body, showing up to school several days later with his whole arm turned green. We found that he had gotten ink poisoning from drawing on himself. Despite his brief time in the hospital, it was that book that started our fascination with the occult. Some years later, after my parents got divorced and Adam's dad fell to his death, we started meeting in the woods and performing spells. As time went on, our spells began to cross the line from innocent fantasies to dark reality. The spells got darker and darker as our lives got more complex. I went to Dan's house the next day, where I found him sleeping off the previous day. "Bad day, sunshine," I joked. "It's an off day," he replied, meaning that he wouldn't drop acid that day because he had built a tolerance to LSD. I knew that acid only works if you double up every day that you take it. The problem is you can only do this for about 5 days in a row, at most, as otherwise it becomes too expensive. Dan's mother yelled up to him from downstairs, "I'm going out for the day with Walter. There's a 20 on the counter for lunch and dinner. Love you." I could hear her high heels clicking on the tile floor, followed by the sound of the back door shutting. "Where's Stephen?" I asked. "Raiding my porn stash," Dan said, nodding down the hall toward the guest bedroom. He rubbed his eyes. "So, what's up?" "Nothing. I found out more about Shamash." I saw his face change from sleepy to solemn as he recognized the name. I explained to him what Pastor Smythe had told me. Stephen walked in with a curious smile. Apparently, he had found Dan's porn stash perfectly acceptable. He sat in and listened to me recount my conversation with Pastor Smythe. After they were both up to speed, I asked Dan where Adam had said that Witch Bonnie had lived. "At the end of Ames Street. That's all I know," he replied. "But that neighborhood's gang-ridden now." I jingled my keys. "Anyone want to come with me?" "I can't," Stephen said, frowning. "I have to pick Destiny up at her house in half an hour." He looked at me. "Just wait until I pick her up and we can all go together." I gave him a you-know-better look, but Dan stood up ready to come with me. "Dan," Stephen said, his voice sounding betrayed, "if you want me to stop and get you some high-grade X, you need to come with me. You know Destiny's parents won't let me in the house." Dan looked like an injured puppy, but his desire for X beat out any curiosity he had about the witch. "All right, then," I said. "I'll check it out myself. But stick around. I'll be back as soon as I find anything." They both nodded. "We can meet you back here around 11 tonight," Stephen said. And with that, I was on another mission. Chapter 7. Let Buried Bones Lie. Ames Street was in a pretty rough neighborhood, in a particularly run-down section of Lowell, and it was well known as a gang territory. Because I was on the Imperial Gangsta's turf, I invoked Marduk to protect me. I was thinking about how this whole section of the city had gone downhill recently, but I focused my energy when I suddenly remembered who had lived on this road many years before. Witch Bonnie. I walked to the end of a dead-end street and stumbled into a heavily wooded area. It reminded me of a dilapidated version of Adam's neighborhood, but maybe I was just reading into things. As I made my way through the thick brush, I started following one overgrown path, wading over the old strollers, air conditioners, television sets, and other garbage that had been abandoned there over the years. The path ended at a barely visible stone foundation, which was the only remaining trace of a small house. What remained was covered in graffiti, mostly ornate numbers divisible by 3, as well as a smattering of crowns and pitchforks. Imperial calling cards, I thought to myself, wondering if these gangbangers knew anything of the history of their hangout. I started to explore the area. Beer bottles, blunt wrappers, and cigarette butts littered the ground. It seemed that anything related to Witch Bonnie disappeared long ago. Discouraged, I began to walk away. As I retraced my footsteps, I remembered the conversation that Witch Bonnie and I had had several days before. There was something she had said which seemed out of place. Who was I kidding? The whole conversation was out of place. But she said something that seemed relevant. We had been in a graveyard, but not a real graveyard. She was talking, but she was on fire. I was running, yet she was hovering ahead of me. I remember thinking that I was going to lose my mind when all of a sudden it hit me. She said that sometimes you need to let buried bones lie. Buried. Witch Bonnie used this exact phrase. It had seemed peculiar at the time, but I guessed that maybe something was hidden underground. It was a long shot for sure, but it was only one night's worth of work. I decided to go back, given the attention I'd attracted as the only Caucasian on the street. As I reached the end of the road, I noticed an old Asian woman staring at me through a dirty window. I nodded in acknowledgement but kept going. I would soon be back under the black veil of night. I told Dan, Stephen, and Destiny what had happened that day, and about my plan to dig up the foundation. I had intended to go back alone, but Stephen insisted that everyone come with me. "I'm tired of you being the only one actively involved," he said. So the next night, we all piled into Stephen's Cadillac. We were all dressed in black. We would usually dress in black, so this wasn't out of the ordinary for us. Destiny was wearing a black niqab that made her look vaguely like a Muslim terrorist. I kept teasing her about it, but it was no fun, as she never appeared to get angry. The loud bass of a house party at the end of the street echoed blindly as we approached. We didn't care who got in front of us. We were on a mission to avenge our departed friend. Or at least we thought we were. Everything was so confusing lately. We went down to the foundation and began digging around the perimeter. I was wearing a flashlight attached to a headband and began digging by what I assumed was the front doorway. Hours passed, and the music died down. We noticed blue lights between the thick of the wooded area and heard the occasional scream and gunshot, but little could distract us. Soon it was nearly 4 in the morning. We had been shoveling for hours. I was motivated by a thirst for resolution for Adam's sake, but even this desire, mixed with great heroin, was not enough to keep up my energy. My body started to feel heavy. I was just about to stop digging when I heard a rustling in the bushes. "It must be a cat," I said quietly. I stopped to light a cigarette and continued shoveling, trying to coax a second wind from my aching arms. Soon I heard the rustling noise again. At this point we all had stopped shoveling and listened for the sound again. There could be no mistaking now. It sounded like someone whispering Cambodian or some other Eastern language. I was not in the mood to fight the imperial gangsters, but I gripped my shovel in anticipation of what appeared to be the inevitable confrontation. I waited for them to pop out of the thick bushes, but they never did. The woods at this point were an uneven landscape of random holes, some shallow, some deep. I was about to give up for the night and chalk the whole venture up to stupidity when I heard Dan yell something. We all gathered around the hole he was digging. He had uncovered an old wooden box made of oak and peppered with tiny holes from what I guessed to be termites. The hinges were rusty and squeaked as we opened it. Inside was an odd-looking book with an emblem printed on the front cover. It was the same emblem that had haunted us the day before. I inspected the book closely, trying to be as delicate as possible while turning the pages. The pages were stained yellow, and several were tattered and torn. For the apparent age of the book, it was in fairly decent shape. I looked inside and saw that they were covered in a handwritten Old English script. It appeared to be a primitive grimoire. It was readable, but the Old English style made it harder to read than the 1611 version of the King James Bible. As I studied the text, I realized that this wasn't just anyone's grimoire. It had a name etched onto the cover. "Clara," I read aloud. Dan looked over my shoulder in fascination. "Clara Bonney." "Which Bonnie?" Stephen said. As tired as we were before, we now had to explore this book of secrets. "I wonder why no one's ever found it," Destiny asked, her voice rising in wonder. "Maybe," Dan said, "when they burned the house, it couldn't burn and was buried in the ashes. Or," Stephen suggested, "maybe Bonnie buried it before the mob came for her. Or maybe she kept it buried." I completed his sentence. We were like little children reading a beloved comic book. We examined each spell, determining whether it was genuine or merely New Age propaganda. Then, about 40 pages in, we found what we had come for. The writing had become shaky and difficult to read, as if the writer was possessed. The topic had also changed from light-hearted love spells to darker, pedophile sex spells. It was hard to read, but one word stood out among all the others: shamash. It wasn't long before the symbol appeared. I didn't know what to make of it. There was a reference to the Book of Enoch, where it talks specifically of binding shamash. The next couple of pages were missing, and there was a weird inscription in the back. "What's this?" I thought out loud. "Beats me," Stephen said. "Looks like some form of Hebrew, maybe Aramaic. Stephen, do you think you can translate it?" "I probably could," he said modestly. "I can use my computer software to try." The rest of the grimoire was comprised of indecipherable spells. Though I had begun to wonder if this had any connection to Adam, we were exhausted and decided to go home. After Stephen dropped me off, I stumbled into my house, took out my kit, and began to break up heroin from the chunks that remained. As I was doing this, it popped into my head that I had been using an awful lot lately. I told myself it was to get past Adam's death, but the truth was that I had bought this stuff long before Adam had committed suicide. One thing at a time, I thought, before snorting a line the size of my pinky finger and going to sleep. I had vivid nightmares of hellish creatures trying to eat me alive. I knew something was chasing me, but I wasn't sure what. Was it Witch Bonnie back for revenge? Was it post-mortem Adam? I couldn't tell. I awoke in a cold sweat to the radio blaring Megadeth. I called Stephen. He was going to drive Destiny to the shelter to visit her mother, but he would be back soon. I tried calling Dan, but there was no answer. He was probably still sleeping. I jumped in the shower and stood underneath the nozzle, absorbing the water for almost an hour. As I dried myself off, I looked in the bathroom mirror. My face was distorted from the heroin. I started to think about Adam and me when we were kids. One day we slept over at his cousin Jeremy's house for Jeremy's birthday. Adam, Dan, Jeremy, and I all slept inside a little three-man tent. But before long, Jeremy went outside and smoked a cigarette, only to be caught by his mother, who forced him to spend the rest of the night in the house. Though we were all confused because we had come to celebrate Jeremy's birthday, Adam took charge in making us forget that our host was gone. We stayed up all night, talking and laughing. It was innocent back then. This was before the stresses of school, life, and love had set in. Since no one was around, I had some time to kill, so I went over to Adam's house. Miriam had passed the initial shock, but I knew Adam's death was something she would never get over. Mikey answered when I knocked on the door, wearing a Patriots jersey and wind pants. His mother was on the couch, just staring at the wall. She wasn't crying, but I could tell she had been earlier. "Hey, Miriam," I said, sitting down next to her and holding her in my arms. I began to cry. As the tears welled up, I realized this was the first time I had cried since Adam died. Miriam sobbed too, whispering through her tears that he's really gone. All I could muster was an insensitive, "I know." We stayed like that for about half an hour. I eventually took charge of my emotions and forced myself to make small talk. We tried not to reminisce, but every topic ended with the conversation being brought back to Adam. Eventually, I remembered the chain of events that had brought me to her home, but decided that Miriam wouldn't know anything. It was probably best not to involve her in our conspiracy theories at the moment. I reached into my pocket to grab my cigarette pack and felt something strange. It was the acid Dan had given me, still wrapped in tinfoil. I remembered that the picture was barely legible. I unwrapped the acid carefully and discreetly. I was positive that Miriam would not recognize the picture, but something told me to ask her anyway. I showed her the picture fragment, and she examined it closely before letting out a cry of what seemed like joy and sadness combined. "I was wondering where that picture went," she said. Bewildered at her recognition, I asked her, "What?" "This was the only recent picture of Adam," she said, still keeping her eyes fixated on the image, "that those men didn't take away." "Miriam," I said, trying to not get too excited, "why is this picture important?" "I don't know," she answered. "It was taken during Adam and Destiny's 8th grade summer break." 8th grade, I thought aloud. "Don't you remember how they dated for a short time?" "Oh, yeah," I said, trying not to reveal my suspicion. "Here you go," she said, handing back the small piece. "Well, Miriam, I have to meet Stephen," I said, trying to dismiss myself as quickly and politely as possible. I waved to Mikey through the sliding glass door, but he was busy watering the lawn out in the backyard. Before I left, I heard Miriam yell out the question I had hoped to avoid. "Jeff, where'd you get that picture?" I pretended that I hadn't heard her and sprinted to my car. As I drove to Stephen's house, I began to do what any rational person does when confronted with uncomfortable information. I questioned the validity of what I'd heard. Could Miriam really tell from the little piece that it was a picture of Adam and Destiny? I figured it would take a huge stretch of the imagination. I'd also never even heard Adam mention Destiny's name even once, outside of talking about Stephen. I figured Adam had never really liked her, only tolerated her, for Stephen's sake. Maybe Miriam was still in shock. Maybe she didn't know what she was saying. I decided to go ask Stephen.